Let's do that again. We don't have to do the clap test again. So, zero to one. Yeah, yeah. All I see is your two. That's the weird thing. Hi, I'm Ryan Stec, one of the directors here at Artengine. Today I'm here with Jesse McKee, who's head of strategy at 221A, who's the cultural center based in Vancouver. 221A is really a unique center in Canada, not only for blurring the boundaries between art and design, but also the focus on research and infrastructure for culture. And there it happens across digital and physical spaces for 221A. This includes, I think, 14,000 square meters of culturally dedicated real estate, which, if we think of that in the context of Vancouver, is quite impressive. But one of the reasons that we're here today is not only the work they do generally, but specifically the kind of leadership that they're demonstrating in the digital domain. So this example of this leadership is this research project, Blockchains and Cultural Padlocks. This is a research initiative started in 2019, a 4-year initiative to sort of forge a path into the blockchain space for culture, to challenge our understandings of value and rethink what a cooperative can be in the 21st century. So the first phase of the report has a wide range of contributors and collaborators, including Rosemary Heather, Maral Sotondimia, I think I'm saying that wrong, so I apologize, Erica Wong, among many others. It's an incredible document, and Jesse is the lead on this project, and he's here to talk about this amazing initiative. Welcome, Jesse.
Hi, nice to see you again, and nice to talk to Ottawa, a city back from my 20s where I spent some time. So, and the Artengine and then the Arts Court building, all very familiar to me. So nice to join you virtually.
It's great to have you here in the space, in the digital space. I think we can dig right into it. Obviously, we'll have links to the project, to the document that we're talking about today, as much as some other primers if people want to get familiar with some of the ideas we're talking about. I think, though, you've got this 4-phase project, so I'd be interested to hear. This report is the sort of first phase, and what are some of the key findings that have come out of this report? Like, what are some of the central ideas that the cultural community should be paying attention to in the blockchain space?
The way we came about getting into it was through the Canada Council for the Arts Digital Strategy Fund. So I think that's important to know, because the way that these funding programs kind of shape organizations and shape the cultural sector is important. So it's pretty much 100, no, not 100, I'd say probably 95% funded from that digital strategy fund. And we're working with those guidelines. And so we were challenged to think about, like, how is your organization going to enter into the digital ecosystem? Not just be a user on social media or kind of be a prosumer or something like that, but what are you going to do to develop infrastructure and support and provide and create value for the communities that you're serving in that way? So what the key findings that we had is, so this project started pre-pandemic, really, and I've been thinking about it since 2017, although we really didn't get going until 2019 when the funding was confirmed and everybody was onboarded. Going throughout the whole kind of like 2016 onwards, we had a great sense that things were changing, and we didn't want to get stuck in any rigidity traps or kind of quicksand as kind of things kind of were coming apart and reassembling in different ways. So this is very much at the same time that things that were coming out, like there's a writer and artist and professor, Jenny Odell, who teaches at Stanford, who wrote a book called How to Do Nothing, which doesn't sound very informative, but actually it is. It's about resisting the attention economy. So I think we're thinking about that and what the attention economy does to people and to culture and to artists and designers. And secondly, thinking through books like Shoshana Zuboff's kind of, what was it called? Can I just do a quick Google and I'll just find that. There it is, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, which is called, and then it has the subtitle, the fight for a human future at the new frontier of power. So I think that was also very informative to us. And that was a very popular book as well, like New York Times bestseller. So we're seeing like the early starts of what later on in the pandemic and post kind of like Trump presidency, kind of we see as a real distrust in Web 2.0, which is Web 2.0 as kind of describes what happened from like YouTube onwards. You know, I remember actually I was in Ottawa studying when YouTube came out, and our professors weren't that interested in it back in 2006. But all of a sudden, you know, now it is the center of the world. But that caused a lot of problems. And so what we needed to do was think about, how do we get out of this situation? How do we build out of here? And how do we start reclaiming the value that we're creating online, and reclaiming our identity and kind of remaking civil society in this space, rather than letting kind of like central corporate platforms like, you know, Meta or Twitter or TikTok or Google provide for us. Because essentially what you're trying to do when you do that is you're trying to build your civil society inside of a shopping mall. And that's not really going to work out well for anybody except the shopping mall owners.
There's kind of like for you, a sort of intuition and a desire to engage those ideas. And then this first, the report is really drawing together sort of a lot of these like-minded thinkers and showing these possibilities. So you have this like, sort of almost pointing to this, like, this is real. This is real, and we need to be here. I wonder if one of the things we could do is place the work that you're doing in the context of artist-run center history and kind of culture. Because for me, I like, it seems like this really important moment for sort of cooperative and collectivization. Like, how can we rethink the spirit that was supposedly at the founding of all of these different types of spaces across the country? How, it feels like it's a moment of revitalization, but also could be an opportunity that's missed. So can you put it a little bit in that context?
So thinking about the artist-run center history is a good way to get into it. One of my previous jobs was the exhibitions curator at the Western Front. And so going back to the Western Front in the early 70s, when it kind of started up as a professional artist-run center in 72, it was kind of found as this collective building, which used to be called Free Call before it was called the Western Front. And the Canada Council kind of found it and kind of started to invest into it with its grants program. And kind of that's kind of one of the earliest artist-run centers in the country. So this digital strategy program might not be incredibly dissimilar from that. I mean, 221A had gotten a little bit of support from Canada Council, but we're a young organization, so we only showed up in 2008. So we're at the bottom of the pile in terms of funding priorities, it feels like, at the Canada Council. We're also founded by non-white Canadians, which probably, was a big deterrent to funding us at a proper rate, even though we were getting there really quickly. So I think, thinking through how do we recollectivize, is we just saw these models as not quite serving us anymore, or not fully serving us. And if we just relied on them to make our future, we'd probably starve, and we would probably end up homeless as an organization, to be honest. Yeah, we really do need to recollectivize, and that's what 221A really wants to do. And that's because 221A comes out of Vancouver's Chinatown, which I think is important to know. Our founders have several generation relationships with the neighborhood, with the Chinese benevolent societies and business in the neighborhood. Which is very important. So we actually look at these benevolent societies more like our elders than something like the Art Gallery or Art Speak might be, because the way that these benevolent societies came about in the early 20th century was through anti-Asian and racist laws that were enacted by the government of Canada, the city of Vancouver, the province of British Columbia, that didn't allow Asian people to own property or operate business or even rent property for that matter. So essentially families would pool their resources under family names like the Yis and the Fungs, and then they would start a nonprofit society in British Columbia which could do the business. But yet the community was then constrained by nonprofit finance, and that capacity for wealth generation amongst the population of Chinatown was limited. So seeing that, and then seeing the kind of property rich but kind of resource and cash poor societies as they are now in the early 21st century, they do need support, and we work with them, and we do co-rent buildings from them and share them between artists and their membership, which is seniors residences, and also membership space for activities and socialization and administration. So yeah, that model of recollectivization, I think, was an opportunity for us to think more broadly about how do we scale up our collaboration to the scale of the neighborhood, to the scale of the city, to the scale of the planet. And so that's basically kind of what blockchain will enable you to do, is to kind of create more mass collaborative networks that are more definable and self-designable by communities themselves. And I think it's a way to kind of personalize, not personalize, but individuate how finance works in certain conditions for certain communities with different cultural protocols than maybe what the Canada Council or the Government of Canada kind of might expect as the way it goes.
Yeah, it's interesting. You describe a kind of a narrative for the organization where it's outsideness, like a kind of beginning late in the sort of history of artist-run culture, and the cultural aspects of the organization, sort of almost positioning it to be more flexible and to be more thinking outside of this kind of core stream. Do you think that, and like, do you see within the wider cultural sphere that you engage with a kind of excitement and a warmth towards this idea of new collectivization, or do you think that there's kind of more of a fear around what the technology is bringing? Like, is it happening to the cultural world, or is the cultural world, imagining a place that they can actually play within it?
I think it's both. I mean, it depends how you define the cultural world, I guess, but anyone dancing on TikTok or creating video games kind of fits under that umbrella for me. So I think that the way that culture developed in Canada was quite, settler-centric, let's put it that way. So I think that the culture is expanding beyond that narrow definition of kind of what culture is. And so I think culture is doing this, but I think the state-funded kind of settler-centric culture in Canada is not doing this, because it's an incredibly, hard culture to kind of distribute resources in, because there is such a scarcity of resources already. So there is already such a fear and such a lack of support for people that they don't know how to get along anymore. And that's what kind of, like, ever since I've entered the sector in Canada, that's the reality that I've known. It's just kind of got less and less and less since, the early 2000s. So with that in mind, I think like the professionalized culture is having a real challenge. They need to figure out what their legitimacy is kind of in the world at this point. I think 221A is pretty confident about kind of what its legitimacy is, because it's not beholden to just that settler-centric culture. I think we talk to it. I think we learn from it. I think we debate it and criticize it. But we're working in many different strands as well. So I think, yeah, there's tons of people using this technology for cultural perspectives. And what's really been interesting, and there's an artist based here in British Columbia called Rhea Myers. She's an incredible early proponent of kind of blockchain cultural practices. And, I think what she's been saying is kind of like, oh, it's interesting because art lets you kind of experiment with this technology. It is not the food chain. It is not the supply chain. It is not the medicine chain. So if something goes wrong, it's not immediately going to be kind of a catastrophe.
No one's going to die necessarily.
Well, not yet, but I think we can say that, but we can also see how culture can shift the digital space. And we saw that over the past 5 years in the Web 2.0 space. And so that long tail, or that kind of heavy impact of how that kind of cultural, forking that kind of happened over the past 5 years, so that we live on different planets basically now than some people who believe certain things. So that's a very dangerous side too.
And I wonder about some of that role of experimentation and imagination that you were describing, and we certainly see that with artists and arts organizations engage with technology, for us, we've always felt like we're at the sort of tumbling, breaking edge of things in a way that makes it sometimes difficult to make the organization and its vision completely transparent to people, because we're trying to always fall as things are changing. And but this is you see artists do that a lot, but organizations tend to are not oriented towards that kind of change. And I think there's this interesting moment where the technology, even if it's not actually enabling genuine innovation in organizational form, there's something about the way it's transforming the imagination for certain people and allowing this space of play. So I think that's a really, sort of exciting part of what's happening. Of course, there is like, there is a history of Web 2.0, as you say, which kind of describes something that is, basically a concentration of wealth, a kind of like a further in sort of implication into all of the aspects of our lives by sort of platform capitalism. And it feels like if we don't involve ourselves, how do we transform it in this way? I wonder if you could speak a bit more to maybe some of how you understand some of these anxieties that many cultural organizations and people in culture might express. I think there's an anxiety around the digitization of everything and the feeling that this is somehow inextricable from the financialization of everything. And it's obviously, I think, somewhat reasonable and justified. And particularly with blockchain, it's inextricable development with cryptocurrency. But how do you understand these anxieties? Like, what might be different about what's happening now than what has happened before that might make new things possible?
First, I would say those anxieties are totally legitimate. I mean, we don't live in a very secure world. So I think, we're at a point of ecosystem breakdown, not just in terms of the ecological system, but the financial and the kind of social mores as well are also going with that. So, it's that everything change moment. But what happens when an ecosystem breaks down doesn't mean extinction for everything. It means like a new ecosystems get built. And this is where things kind of recompose, where new energy, new agents, new actors kind of encounter each other, and then they have to decide how to build out what's next. So that's really what I see in the long arc of this technology. And that's the kind of why I'm invested in it. I think thinking through this idea of the fear of the technology, I think there's something there too about, the North American brain or the settler-centric brain being somewhat, Akile Mbembe calls it like a Western paranoia because there has been such a lack of ability to build ourselves for so many generations. Whereas he's talking about his context, he's Cameroonian, I believe. And so in kind of Central Africa, he's thinking through kind of, how is this different? Because everybody is engaged in building something. Nothing comes pre-made, nothing comes ready to go, nothing comes bricked. You have to make your business, you have to make your community, you have to make your home, you have to make your system yourself. So I think we're gonna have to get back into that mode and to kind of reignite those parts of our brain and just start rebuilding ourselves and building out what works for our communities. And so that's what I see as a real potential in this technology, because it's a chance for us to kind of reset how finance works through the digital space for communities. And that's not just what's happening on the website, but this is going to be connecting to physical stuff as well. We're just seeing how this works with kind of digital assets now, but pretty much there's going to be this kind of connectivity and this dance back and forth between what happens in virtual space and what happens in physical space. And they'll be linked and they will influence and kind of co-evolve together. I think there's other things in there to think about in terms of someone like Benjamin Bratton as well, who says that, we don't live like in cities anymore. We live inside of an accidental megastructure. So as humans, what we've done is we've built a global system that we live inside that is so big that we no longer have total control over it, or no one has a single point of view on what's happening. And at the same time, this has also started to kind of deteriorate the conditions of our planet. However, we wouldn't know our planet is deteriorating unless we had developed a world computer so advanced that it was able to model and give us an understanding of what this planet is doing or going under. So there's an epistemological kind of hurdle you have to get over here, which is like, there's no way to solve this issue by going backwards. You can only go forwards and further deeper into it to kind of start to kind of connect the dots better.
Well, it's like a continual unbreaking of the modern fallacy of there being a sort of human control over things, right? That it's like there is it's almost like when you speak to people who do their PhD, and that the deeper they get into their PhD, they realize how little and little they know. Like every step is to learn how much you do not know about the world, so that has always been a kind of reality of life. And so to figure out how to exist within that. I wonder if you could also talk about, in the report you mentioned the exploration of value, so talking about this financialization in terms of the blockchain. That seems like it's so solidified in our minds. But I think there's, something interesting to be said about the different ways we think about value and how to like connect these to the digital, which is, I think, something, again, to your point of art being a great place to push and experiment in the blockchain, because we can think about how these different ideas connect to this digital technology.
It's an incredible technology that recognizes the value of the social, and it recognizes the value of the labor that we do together that might not have been quantified previously, that provided so much in our lives, but yet people like us who worked in the cultural industries, who really kind of lived off of relationships and the strength and the validity of those relationships, now in 2021, we're struggling to find places to live because our incomes are pretty stable, but yet our cultural value has kind of risen to such a point that we're able to kind of use it kind of within this blockchain space. And so just as an example for that, there's the social token community is really interesting, I think, because that's a space where you can start to build community, and like the earlier you are in that community and the more that you put into that community, then you're able to kind of ride that updraft in that community as the value of what that community is doing, your place in it, starts to rise. And you might not see a difference in terms of like what you're doing day to day for that community over the year 1 to year 5, but yet the value of what you're doing for that community can increase because that community grows out. There's more people who are bringing value to that community. You're kind of closer to the center. And I think it's also just kind of remembering that, you're not everything is going to be given to you, like at a bar. Like you can't just go up and order your culture. You can't just go up and order your relationships. It's not Tinder. You don't have this for artists in the art world. So it's kind of like you got to work at it, and you've got to create these bonds, and you have to build trust, and you have to build legitimacy. And I think that's what we lost over the past 10 years, and why things have broken down so much. So there's a big shift too. So that anonymity that kind of came out in the early blockchain is kind of going away now. So, I mean, there's still some communities who really like their anonymity, but there's some other communities who really prize, like, presenting yourself. What do you bring to the world? Who are you? What relationships do you hold? And so I think, this is going to encourage younger and younger generations to think through that very carefully. And, I think it's a real big remedy to kind of shit posting and the kind of vitriolic behavior on kind of Web 2 of the past couple of years.
Yeah. Can we even go a little bit further into, outlining the edges of what a new cultural organization that integrates this technology kind of looks like? Like maybe, combining a little bit of fantasy and desire of what you would love to see, and then a little bit, I think you have a very a great sense of the sort of state of the art of the technology. Can you sort of sketch us out something what it actually might look like in some of the mechanics and form?
Totally, yeah. So it's not just me who are thinking about this, but it's everyone under the umbrella of our project in the first phase, and we're just going into our second phase now. And so we're actually doing a design sprint for the next couple of months that's going to kind of imagine exactly this, like what could 2218 do within this kind of like DAO landscape, or the decentralized autonomous organization, or distributed organization kind of scenario. And so essentially that's the core idea, and that's what we're seeing as like the organizing structure online. And so it's just people who want to build together and who want to share common resources together and who want to distribute those resources together. And so how that looks right now, it's a lot of people on Discord managing kind of communities and channels and administration channels and activity channels and games and meetups and live events and publishing and music recommendations and making music videos within the community and that sort of thing. And so it's very different than a Facebook group, I would put it that way. It's got a lot more capacity to mold it into whatever you want it to be. 22NA is part of a pretty interesting community called Friends with Benefits that's kind of coming out of this space. And they've started doing real life meetups, and they've actually started kind of self-organizing in kind of denser cities where their membership is found right now, like New York, Los Angeles, and London, to have more regular kind of cyclical events. And then there's the kind of global community that kind of connects through. But this isn't that different than the way that I lived in culture in like the last decade. You know what I mean? It's kind of like it was just more diffuse, but this is like a more structured way to kind of understand what's going on. Whereas like in the past, someone would just kind of recommend who you kind of hook up with, like in the city that you're going to. They'll kind of give you a connection to some venues, some people, some producers.
And I think of we were once a kind of traditional production center a little bit, where like the idea was to have physical resources and educational resources that centered a geographic community around it that you would collectivize and get access to, things like projectors when those were really difficult to access. Same with video co-ops throughout the country, that these kind of collectivization. So, but other than say like shifting the focus into the digital realm, which gives it a little bit less geographic aspect. Although it's interesting that it starts out to kind of be sort of this pan-geographic kind of thing that then starts to ground itself in community-based things. But other than this sort of networked aspect of it, what do you see as, like, let's say 5 years down the road, like what could you imagine in your, in the best possible case of something that happens, an organization that takes shape?
Yeah, that's also why we're doing it, is like we think long-term at 22NA. So we're also working on a land trust at 22NA, which is going to assemble, it's not going to be owned by 22NA, but we're going to kind of give birth to this land trust. And so we're looking at how we're going to assemble properties in different parts of the city, essentially. So that's kind of, we're pursuing that with kind of traditional finance right now and kind of traditional means, setting it up as a separate nonprofit. But as this technology will allow for, we're going to start to connect the dots between kind of what this model could be, and then how this model can evolve into something that can be common, or how the governance of something like this could be broadly distributed. And so the surface area of governance of all the people involved in those properties could be better captured, rather than just having like a board of directors that's a representative of certain aspects of that organization. Actually, your governance is distributed to hundreds of people, and they're involved in making key decisions about the organization and how it allocates resources. So that's like an interesting side of it. And I don't think it's about doing away with the physical at all. Again, it's about making the physical more secure and more stable, and allowing it to link up with kind of digital communities in more kind of organic and kind of productive ways. And so, kind of these plans for collective ownership of physical assets, this is totally going to be managed through distributed autonomous organizations. It's already beginning. There was City DAO, which is its own thing. They just purchased their first plot of land in Wyoming, where Wyoming has made a law available so that DAOs can exist as legal entities. Basically, you can have a LLC, or a limited liability corporation, that's controlled by a distributed autonomous organization for the first time in the world, and that's in Wyoming. And now they've bought a land preserve, and they're going to start developing that kind of as what they could see and as the future. So all eyes are on that. We're working with a group coming out of Kyiv called Doma, which is a cooperative housing platform as well, for this sort of thing. So it'd be a way to kind of manage equitable and affordable housing at city scale, but it could also exist in different cities. So those more expensive cities could lend equity to kind of less expensive cities, and vice versa, to kind of even out the conditions between a certain community as well. So there's all kinds of potential there. There's thousands of people building this future. They're some of the brightest, most creative and curious people that I've met. So I'm excited about it.
So is a land trust, is that an already given kind of legal entity that you guys are thinking of how to like adapt it to a new sort of digital governance model?
Yeah, we just incorporated it last week as a BC society, which is great. And then I think what we're going to be looking at is like, what's the potential here for developing out this technology to provide for better governance, to help us solve some of the human coordination and the challenges that we have in trying to kind of create a land trust that is equitable and that has a really strong kind of anti-racism plan around it too. So, I mean, that's what's interesting about this too, is you can mold your finance, your equity, and your governance around the cultural protocols that are valuable to the community that you want to serve. So and it's not going to be easy either, because the regulatory for environment for this stuff doesn't exist yet. So it's also organizations like us who want to get in early, who want to talk to partners across the board, from communities to the nonprofit space, to the technology space, to the development space, to the city planning office, and start trying to connect those conversations and try to, we're moving into becoming what's called like a systems convener at 221A, and we're trying to get different systems to talk to each other to solve similar challenges and similar problems between each system. And so that's really what I think this technology kind of can help us do.
The last thing you said there was going to be one of my follow-up questions, was like, where are the impediments to thinking and putting things into action in this domain, like trying to do something like what you're doing with DOMA? Is it really a question of the kind of legal structure? Is it the sort of I don't know, the tax implications for an organization that is like, because we basically have kind of two models in Canada, right? We have, you're either a for-profit company or you're a nonprofit, and you could have a nonprofit with a charity, but like outside of that, there isn't really a lot of formal infrastructure for those models. But is it there, or is it other places where you're seeing some of the largest impediments to making this happen?
For us, it's definitely in the regulatory space. I wouldn't call it an impediment. It's just like untouched space. It's not dealt with. It's like, so, but they know they need to deal with it. But that's also, our governments are incredibly stressed right now. They have no idea how to move forward in a lot of situations. In BC, we have a lot of problems to deal with: the opioid crisis, COVID, we have the climate, which is breaking down here. So, but at the same time, the province has, in the past couple of months, hired an amazing economist, Mariana Mazzucato, who wrote The Value of Everything and kind of thinks through mission economics. And so what she's seeing is like, it's not about this kind of Cold War scenario of the market and the state, and these are these two polar economies that we have to keep separate. Well, that's been a myth that's been breaking down my whole lifetime. But at this point, we're kind of, we're looking at, she's kind of been hired to kind of advise the government in BC kind of how we get to an integrated economy, or how business and community is able to kind of think through, how do you just bring value to this scenario so that people are able to build out of it? How do you kind of meet shared goals around climate, around technology access, around housing? And how do you make these very high benchmarks that the entire society can get behind and start kind of working towards, is what's called mission economics. So that's the kind of future we're seeing. We're seeing it as a very messy, kind of lumpy place right now, but that's also where like a theorist, like someone like Keller Easterling, would kind of look at this technology too, is that it's here to connect those lumpy, imperfect, hard to manage silos kind of in our society together. And we'll be able to kind of like fine tune it and bootstrap it so that things just start connecting better. And then once that happens, we'll get towards things that are just working. And once something works, communities will start using it, and then it will start getting better. So at this point, we do have a lot of impediments because it's not so much the regulatory space. I would say that the protocol stack within the blockchain space is too large and the application stack is too small. So the protocol stack is only going to be understood by 10% of the community who understands what blockchain is, whereas 90% of us are going to be on the application stack, receiving the benefits, using the dApps, that sort of stuff. So we haven't had that experience. We don't have those stories. We don't have those narratives yet to tell. And you need to be pretty bold and not afraid of embarrassing yourself at some of these technical tables sometimes to kind of ask basic questions. So there's that. But and I think, yeah, around that regulatory space, that it's also a challenge for us, but we're seeing it more like someone like the McConnell Foundation in Montreal kind of is thinking through what can we do to get communities into these regulatory experimentation spaces to try and think about how do we start solving challenges. And then once one community learns that, then let's broadcast that and share that information across, because I don't think we're going to find global solutions right now, but at the scale of neighborhoods or communities of that scale, I think we'll be able to find small incremental solutions that can build on top of each other and that can be shared and then relocalized kind of in a particular community depending on its values and its protocols.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, a really key point to, and one of the reasons why, we want to have these conversations in our digital space, so that we're trying to figure out where the interesting things are happening that can be shared across the cultural landscape, and that landscape is kind of you can't disentangle it from the social and political landscapes of every city. And we're not going to come up with global solutions necessarily, but how to create these networks of communication and sharing and stuff like that, which is, I think, this, one of the, going back to where we started with the Canada Council, one of the challenges of this that I see in the Digital Strategy Fund, which is this exceptional research project for organizations across the country, but how we're able to share that information because of the way the Canada Council is structured as a kind of arm's length government agency, where like all of this stuff is going out in this siloed way, and the amount of research that is not being shared and not being communicated and not being shared in common is quite sad. And how we kind of overcome that is sort of, I think, a really key point to the success of everything. So it's interesting to see, and it's amazing to see what you guys are doing with not only putting out the information in these kind of report things, but being out there yourself and speaking with people and seeing some of that conversation happen.
Yeah, I'm glad to do it. It's part of the funding guidelines. We got to share these findings. I mean, they put it on us, basically. The Digital Strategy Fund was you have to share your findings with the sector. But of course, it takes organizations like you who can send around media kits with nice cameras and microphones to interview us for that stuff. So it's really appreciated. We'll have some more stuff coming out in the spring. So we'll have a public documentation of that design sprint where we're DAO modeling. So that'll be there. And also stay tuned. And we just went through the whole list of digital strategy funded projects to find anybody working with blockchain, and we're about to contact them to kind of call everybody together just to kind of see what we need as a community. And then later in the spring, probably second half of March, we haven't quite scheduled it or got it totally together. There's not a call yet, but we're going to be offering a free to access kind of multi-day workshop with, we're organizing it with Blockchain at UBC, which is Canada's largest blockchain research cluster, and the Ethereum Foundation, but it'll be a workshop designed specifically for cultural nonprofits to kind of just get their feet wet, say what they're curious about, say what they're challenged by, and just to start learning and doing a few things kind of within this workshop scenario. We'll be working with some amazing kind of professors and students from the research cluster at UBC as well, to kind of support us on the technical side of it, and some folks from the Ethereum Foundation too, who help us put together some of this, because they've been doing some of these kind of workshops within the European cities as well for much larger nonprofits like UNESCO or that's not even nonprofit. That's kind of like a UN organization or like Oxfam or something global of that scale. But I think this is the first time in Canada we'll see something like this for nonprofits. So we really want to drive that, and kind of we really want to just be the icebreaker organization that can kind of help organizations get into this and talk to partners and regulators and that stuff.
It's interesting. It makes me think that like one of the key components, we were going back to that part about the collectivization that would like, well, you needed access to a really expensive camera, so everybody had to pull together, but now it's developers. Like what we need is to be able to basically have a kind of, a small staff of developers that an entire ecosystem could because there's all of these small organizations with 2-3 staff across the country, which could do really innovative things if there was a kind of collectivization of some of the back-end technology expertise. That could be a really interesting place to move for sure. Well, I really thank you a lot for the time. It's so exciting to hear what 221A is doing now and the arc that's coming. We'll be sure to try and amplify all those things. Some of them will hopefully be ready to be linked by the time our conversation's online. So.
I hope so. Stay tuned. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, our website, 221a.ca to find out more.
Great. Thanks.